federalism is a fantastic thing in the sense that you can have competition that can lead to better outcomes. But I know this, that you can also have the possibility of pockets of sort of backwardness happening and not much to change those.
Michael Mitchum, thank you for coming to AEI.
Thank you.
So you've got a new book out, Public Policy, aptly named, but inside your book you're actually bringing forth an argument, and it's about investment-based policymaking and policy analysis. Why investments, and give us a thumbnail of your argument.
Okay, well, when I was thinking about public policy in general and where are we in terms of what governments do in the world, I felt that there was a lot of instances out there where governments are spending a lot of money on programs that are not well evaluated. There's a question about whether they're good value for money, and we really don't know why is it that we've got them in place, other than that they've been around for a while and they seem to have political support. So I was quite interested in developing a way of thinking about this where we actually say, are policies developing a good return on investment? Are they really doing for society the best they can?
And how do you ask governments to go about determining where investments are paying off?
Well, it's actually using a lot of the approaches that they've already got in place, but they just don't pull them all together. So it's saying evaluate something and figure out what is it that you're trying to achieve here and how much is it costing. So you can do cost-benefit analysis, combine that with evaluation, and get a sense of what's the return on investment. So in terms of early childhood education, an area like that, we can figure out through analysis what kind of programs work well and what gains for society we get from them. But often we don't do that.
Right. Now, of course, governments, they make decisions using evidence to make policy, and sometimes policy to make evidence. I'm just curious, what's the balance here in practice that you see between sort of the political side of decision making and the analytical side that might focus more on strict investments?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about a way of doing policy analysis that's a bit different from currently done, or at least some of it is done this way at the moment, but I think a whole lot more of it could be done. Sure. So I'm thinking of that as a kind of a counterpoint to the politics of it all. And I don't want to discount politics. I mean, there's always going to be politics around policy making, that's for sure. But I do think that the analysis could be done in a way that is more consistent and could actually give politicians better information upon which to make their judgments than they get right now.
Right. I've leafed through the book. You have one really interesting example. The Williamsburg Bridge in Brooklyn. Can you just tell me about that example and how perhaps an investment approach to taking care of that bridge could have been a little bit more advantageous?
Well, it's an interesting case where a new bridge was built, and I guess it was needed, and there was a lot of respect for the fact that it was built, but then the politicians moved on to other things, so they didn't actually care about routine maintenance. And in fact, it was, and it seems unbelievable, but it's actually true, that it took about 75 years before any routine maintenance check was done to see how the bridge was going. And when that happened, the engineers were kind of shocked and said, we've got to do some pretty serious structural work on this bridge in order to get it up to standard, unless we get or we could run the risk of a catastrophe.
Right.
So then the focus became, how do you do maintenance on the bridge without having to shut it down, which would create all sorts of traffic havoc in place. But I think the bigger picture, and why I focus on it in the book, is that in fact, if they had done routine maintenance in those 75 years previously, like every 5 years they'd gone and done a serious inspection and done the maintenance that was necessary, they would have saved themselves much more than what they had to spend as the bill after leaving it for so long. So it's similar to an individual not going to the dentist for many, many years and then going and having to do a face full of fillings and all the rest of it. It's that kind of thing. But I think that it's a metaphor for we can think of the bridge as a metaphor for a lot of things in infrastructure maintenance throughout the United States or other countries, but also maybe we could think about it even more broadly in terms of some sort of social programs too.
Right. Well, it's interesting to bring up the idea that governments that are politically driven can be very animated by a new program, but sustaining programs, making sure they're well funded and sustainable over the long term, not always the politician's first foot forward.
That's right. And I've always sort of thought that makes sense, that politicians love to announce new programs, not necessarily do stuff on the old stuff that's in the background. And I was talking about this one day, and someone came up to me and said, you know, I'm not sure that politicians always get kudos just for the shiny things too. You know, in a world now where we're thinking a lot about, you know, renewing things and conservation and that kind of thing, that in fact there could be a way that politicians could get political mileage out of talking about maintenance.
Right.
I'm not sure, but I like the thought process.
There's always the hope that the politicians will move closer to the side of the policy analysis.
Well, it's kind of a point really about the politics of reframing, actually, and saying, well, you know, what are the things that we should be caring about here? You think about the US, there's a lot of fantastic infrastructure in place, wonderful airports and subway systems and all the rest of it, but with a bit more routine maintenance, they could be that much better.
Right. So, you know, I study education, American education primarily. What are some ways that a investment approach could help inform U.S. education policy and inquiry and maybe political decision making?
Well, I'll give you an example on that I think is one that, you know, lots of people would have thought about as a parent, I think this. You kind of like small class sizes. I think a small class size is better than a bigger class. But in fact, when states have tried to introduce small class sizes, they've often had pretty unhelpful results. California experimented with this and spent a lot of money. One of the things that happened was that they found that teachers going into the classroom sometimes were less qualified than they would have been. They needed many more teachers in order to be in there.
Right.
So they didn't get the bang for the buck that they were hoping for from the small class size. Well, this is where the kind of analysis that I've been talking about in the book and advocating could really help out. There's a education scholar called John Hattie, and he's done a lot of careful analysis of a whole range of different programs, meta-analysis. And what he shows is that actually very well-trained teachers can do a lot with classes that are fairly big. So class size doesn't really matter. What he says is it's much more about the way that they teach and the feedback they give to students. You can get a bigger return on investment from the training of teachers than you could from the size of the classroom itself.
Sure. It's interesting. One of the things that you bring up in the book is that a lot of these new programs and things that we evaluate are marginal changes. They're not inventing things out of whole cloth. And while on the one hand I see the utility of that, on the other hand I worry that a focus on sort of assessing marginal changes to existing programs means that big leaps, big risks might be out of favor in this investment framework. Am I wrong?
It's a good point. I think that is a risk, actually. On the other hand, the general approach is saying we've got a lot of evidence out there and we just have to use it in a smarter way. And also one of the things that I talk about in the book is not necessarily feeling like we need to use evidence from the particular program that we're interested in to make adjustments to it. So it might be, and this is perhaps how you start to make the leap, you could look around and say, well, you know, let's take an interest in what they're doing in Singapore with respect to criminal justice, or what they're doing in Finland with respect to education, and how can we kind of replicate that here? So that would be how you could make the big shifts.
Sure. So you've done work in New Zealand and are now in Australia, but you know, America has a federalist system of education. So we have 50 states to do this in. Is that an advantage for us to sort of learn from each other?
Well, I think it is. I think that federalism is a fantastic thing in the sense that you can have competition that can lead to better outcomes. But I know this, that you can also have the possibility of pockets of sort of backwardness happening and not much to change those.
Right.
So I like the federalist system in the sense that with respect to education, you can actually look across 50 states and say which states are doing things really well and how can we learn from that kind of thing. I guess what you're getting at is that the mechanisms for a change are not necessarily there. So if Wisconsin's doing something fantastic, it's not necessarily the case that one of its close neighbours is going to pick up on it, for example, or other states are going to look to it. Or they might look to it and then say, but it's not the same for us.
Right.
So that's always a risk.
A big piece of this is evaluating what we do, measuring our impacts, measuring how much we spend on the programs, and putting actual investments in getting the information that we need to make wise investment-based decisions. How would you say we're doing on making sure that that evaluative information is coming out from government programs?
I think we're getting better at it, and I think there's much more awareness now of just how important evaluation is. I think that the next part that we're going to have to getting into is actually talking about the getting some standardization across the evaluations that are done. It's a tough one. And I mean, I'm not saying we can do this in the next year or two or anything like that. I think it's a long-term, probably a few decades it'll take. But if you think about this, if we could get a situation where there's more common agreement on what a really good cost-benefit analysis looks like in a particular area, say of education, or what a good evaluation looks like, then there's a possibility that knowledge that's generated around a particular program in New York could very well inform, there's no reason why it couldn't inform what's going on in a school or a school system in Texas, for example, or similarly internationally. So maybe there's a space for particular organisations like the OECD to get involved and help to coordinate, so that we don't get a whole lot of over-assessment or over-evaluation of certain programs and losing out on evaluations of others, but we can actually learn from things in that way.
Sure. So, Michael, there's one other case of the book that I thought was really interesting, and that's the nuclear power plant case, which has sort of two angles. One, the role of government, and the other, the role of sort of private enterprise in this investment logic. Can you talk about that one?
Yeah, so when I was looking at the cases of infrastructure investment in the United States, I noticed that nuclear power plants had been deregulated, I think it was in the 1990s. And as a result of that deregulation, there was quite a lot of consolidation of ownership. Now, a couple of things are worth considering here. One is that when the local authorities that had been governing the power stations sold them off, they had revenues that they could spend on other things, and that's freeing up resources in some ways. But just as interestingly, a few large companies bought up these power plants. And as a result of sort of having good operating procedures across the system, they got much better at doing maintenance, routine maintenance, more efficiently. So the plants were running for longer each year than they had been under the more decentralized public ownership. And I think probably people, thinking about nuclear power plants, there's always that worry about safety. But in fact, the safety records of the bigger companies running the plants, in fact, got better. And I think that again is a kind of an efficiency or a scale efficiency point. Why I sort of focus on that is this. There can often be times when we have a technology that's perhaps a little bit uncertain, or some aspects of doing something, we say this would be a good thing to do, we're just not quite sure about it. Maybe it makes sense for government to be involved early on there. And certainly in terms of developing a lot of infrastructure in many countries in the world, government's been there in the early stages, and it could be the case for power plants, also for telecommunications. But as the technology gets known and understood and becomes stable, there's no reason why it needs to remain in government hands. So it could then be passed over to the private sector, privatised, that set up as state-owned enterprises and then privatised, for example. And I think it's really important to think of that as an investment as well, and not just think that that government needs to introduce whole new programs or new ways of doing things, but you can actually make some quite interesting kind of incremental adjustments that will have positive returns to society.
Sure. So my last question is something on the limits of the investment mindset. On the one hand, and we could think about this as a private-public distinction, even if that's just illustrative. On the one hand, there's a number of folks, including me, who will argue that oftentimes private enterprises can be more efficient than public enterprises because they're focused on narrow goals. The investment framework really works for them because oftentimes profit is the driving motive. Public enterprises, government in particular, they have lots of competing goals. And so defining those goals that then the investments can work towards, right? What is the return that we want from our investment? seems like it can muddy the water. How do we square that circle?
Look, I'm not going to, pretend that it's easy stuff. This is tough stuff. But I think that one of the things that we've got to start doing more is actually say right at the start, like, what are the things we're trying to get out of this area? What's the sort of the public value we're seeking? So with respect to education or healthcare spending, any area of spending, environmental policy, what are the goals that we have here? And try and actually enumerate those. And it may be cases where there are some goals that a lot of people agree on, and then there are others that we don't. So look at the ones where we have a common agreement, sure, and then start saying, well, if that's a goal that a lot of us want to achieve, what would be the best way to achieve that? And then on that, we would actually look around and say, well, where else have we actually seen, or what are some really good operating examples of achievement of those goals, and how could we start thinking about taking an investment approach there? So that would be my first point. It's not to discount the politics, but sure, to actually say within it there are some things we can do.
Right.
And the bigger project, I suppose, that I'm trying to put forward here is to just say that I think that policy advising could become even better than it is right now, and that's being a bit more systematic about stuff, but actually starting to do something I don't think we've been, as a profession, been particularly good at, is actually drawing comparisons across spending, let's say on defence versus education, right, versus healthcare versus infrastructure, sure, science funding, all the rest of it, and so putting it all together there and saying, well, what do we actually know and how can we move forward? That's been a big thing to me.
Well, it may be a way to bring a little bit more discipline to political decision making, and if so, I'm all for that. Michael Mentrum, thanks for coming by AEI.
Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Michael Mentrum. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint, and be sure to subscribe for more videos and research from AEI.